Hey there, Martin here. And this is yet another course of mine that I decided to upload completely to the channel. This one is about game art, using Inkscape for making the graphics of a block puzzle game like Tetris or something similar. This course is perfect for beginners to vector illustration, to brush up on the basics. It lasts about an hour or so, and it's made of 6 lessons which are all time-stamped so you can skip around. Check out the description below. This course does require some basic knowledge of Inkscape, but I want to remind you that I just uploaded a full Inkscape course, which will get you up and running with the program super fast. You can see it here on the channel, I'll leave you a link in the description. I plan to continue uploading some of my older courses. Let me know in the comments if this is something that interests you or if you have any other question. I'll try to answer right here. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any future uploads. Having said that, enjoy the course.
Let's start with the pieces, the most important part of a Tetris-style puzzle game. There are a lot of possible ways you can draw a piece. If you check other Tetris-like games, you'll see shiny pieces, flat pieces, or round border pieces. The important part is to make them nice looking and consistent with the rest of the game's style. Now, I can't possibly go through every way you can make a Tetris piece, but I can show you the most common styles you see in Tetris-style puzzle games. From there you can mix and match and use your creativity to come up with nice looking visuals for your games. But before we begin, I want to call attention to the way Tetris pieces and the whole game is constructed. In most styles you'll see a Tetris piece made by using perfect squares. These squares are rearranged in groups of 4 to make the classic shapes of Tetris. Of course, if you are making a Tetris-inspired puzzle game that's not a Tetris clone, then you could arrange them in any shape you may want. But if it is at least inspired by Tetris somehow, chances are that the pieces are built by using this rule of constructing them using squares. Let's start with the basics, the classic Game Boy style of flat-looking Tetris pieces. First, pick the rectangle tool. We want a square, right? So at the moment of drawing the rectangle, hold Ctrl. This will make the rectangle snap to an angle. The Game Boy style had a clear outline, so give it a stroke and pick a color. I'm gonna be using the fill and stroke dialog, cause later in a minute I'll be using a couple of features from there. As always, I prefer to set the colors using the HSL mode, and I recommend you to use it. You'll see why in a minute. You could leave it here and build your shapes with this simple square, but let's add some basic detail. Select the square and duplicate it with Ctrl D. Now the duplicate version is here on top and selected. So what I want to do is to inset the square a bit, so hold Ctrl and Shift at the same time, and using any of the arrows, scale in. Now you should disable the color of the inner square. You'll see why in a minute. Okay, one last step to finish up your first tile. For this we need enable the snapping options, so find the snap bar and click on the very first button. Now, the next few options should be toggled on by default, but in case they are not, make sure that the first button in the second group of options in the bar is toggled on. And also make sure the third button of the second group is also toggled on. Now with those snapping options enabled, pick the pen tool and making straight lines, click on the 4 corners, making this trapezoid shape, connecting the corners of the 2 squares. If the snapping options are enabled, you should see this little X just before putting the nodes. It's very important that you complete the whole trapezoid shape, not just connect the corners, because we are giving it color later on. Make all 4 trapezoid shapes. Now there is one last little detail that you may have noticed. Take a look at the corners of the square. You'll notice this stroke section sticking out. This belongs to the trapezoid corners, so let's fix it. The problem is in the node's joint type. By default, the program joins all corners with a nice sharp corner joint. And this works great for most of the shapes, but it may end up creating these long corners that stick out too much. We can change the joint type of all joints in a shape by going to the Stroke Style tab in the Fill and Stroke dialog, and here you'll see these three options. Pick the second one. Most of the time you'll want your shapes to have the sharp type joint, so there's no need to worry about these options too much. And here is it, the basic building block for your Tetris pieces. Now to change the color, just select the back shape, the only one with fill, and give it color. There are a lot of small changes you can do with this shape. For example, you could make the outline thicker than the inner lines, or maybe change the proportions of the inner square. Make it larger or smaller. Or maybe you could delete the trapezoid shapes and make the pieces a bit more simple. Before continuing, here is a nice tip to handle complex objects. You can select all objects and hit Ctrl G to group everything. Now you can handle it as if it were a single object, which is way more comfortable to work with since you don't have to worry about accidentally moving some part. And if you don't want to modify something, you can just as easily ungroup it by hitting Ctrl-Shift-G. To actually build your Tetris pieces is super simple. Make sure snapping is enabled, select the squares and duplicate them. Place them one right next to each other. If you're going for a traditional Tetris game, remember that all Tetris pieces are made of 4 of these tiles. And save this tile, because we'll be reusing it later. But now I want to show you another super simple style for pieces that you see all the time. Draw a square, but this time using the built-in modifier, round the edges a bit. Now give it a color, give the stroke a darker shade of the fill color. Now here is a quick technique to give a shape's fill or stroke a color that is darker or lighter than the one in other shape. For this we are gonna use the HSL color selection mode in the fill and stroke dialog. So first, sample the color that you want to make darker or lighter. In this case I'm using the dropper tool. The default shortcut is the D key, so it's super easy to use. And since I want to change the color of the stroke rather than the fill, when I sample the color, I want to hold Shift. And this will apply the color to the stroke of an object, rather than the fill. Now the fill and the stroke of the square have the same color. And that's what we want, because now we can go to the Stroke tab, and in the HSL color selection mode, go to the L slider. This slider controls how dark or light a color is, and here you can see that to the left of the color it gets darker, and to the right it gets lighter. In this case I'll move it just a bit to the left, so it's a bit darker than the fill. And a nice thick stroke. Now for the next part we are gonna need to enable snapping again. And again make sure the same 2 buttons are toggled on. Even if a built-in rectangle has the borders rounded a bit, if you have those options enabled in the snap bar, you can still snap to the corners. I suppose that is because you are applying a modifier, so technically the nodes are still in the corners hidden. Anyway, just pick the pen tool and create this triangle by snapping to the edges. You don't want those corners of the triangle that stick out of the square. To cut that area that leaves the silhouette of the square, you could use an intersection. So duplicate the square using Ctrl D, select the duplicated square and the triangle. You may need to zoom in a bit to be able to select the two shapes using the Shift key. And now hit Ctrl* to perform the intersection operation. Because only the intersection between the two shapes is left, the excess that sticked out of the rounded square is gone. Now it's up to you to make this shape a darker or lighter shade by using the same technique I showed you a minute ago. Sample with the dropper tool and pick the color with the L slider. It's almost done. If you zoom right in, you'll see that the new shape that is on top is blocking half of the stroke of the square. This is due to the way Inkscape places the strokes. This, however, has a very simple solution. Just duplicate the square and it will be placed on top. And now simply hide the fill. And it's done. Now you can group it if you want. Again, there are a lot of small variations you can make, like changing the roundness of the square, adding a curvature to the triangle, or even completely changing the triangle shape. You should definitely experiment by yourself and see what you can come up with. This next one is admittedly a bit gimmicky, but it's really easy and fun to do, and it looks really good, so it won't hurt to learn how to make them. We're gonna create some fake 3D pieces. First, build your Tetris shape by placing a square and duplicate them with Ctrl D, just to make sure the proportions are correct. I recommend you to select all 4 squares and perform a union by using Ctrl and plus. This will join all 4 objects into a single path, so it's easier to control. Duplicate the shape and move it a bit up or down depending on what you want, and then left or right. Now, using the pen tool and with the snapping options enabled, fill the side planes by creating this parallelogram that connects the two shapes. And make this for each individual side plane. Now here comes the fun part. You need to give color to each of the planes. But there are some rules. First, you have to think what is the imaginary light. Most of the time you'll want a top or front light, so the planes will have to be lightened accordingly. Use the same technique I showed you before to select the lightness of the different planes. Here's a quick illumination setup that is good enough for these simple pieces. The front plane, the one that defines the shape, will have the color that you want. In this case I picked this light orange. We'll have either a slightly lighter or darker shade of that color. All planes that point to the same direction should have the same color. And the planes that point to the side will usually be the darkest shade. And that's it. Remember that this is supposed to be a fake 3D effect, so there is no need to get into realistic projection or anything like that. Depending on where you position the copy that's gonna be the front side of the piece, you'll get different views and depthness. Now let's continue with the slightly more complex Tetris pieces. Remember when I told you to save the first piece we made, because we'll be reusing it later on? Well, now's the time to reuse that piece, so bring it in, or take a minute to redraw it. What we'll be doing now is creating a more detailed looking piece, and to do that, we are gonna need to play around with creating different trapezoids, making them look as if they were different angled planes, and changing the color like we did with the 3-dimensional pieces. So select the top trapezoid and remove the stroke, and give it a completely white feel. Do the same with the one on the right. Now for the one at the bottom and on the left. Do the same, but this time give it a full black. Now you can safely delete the square in the middle, the one we used as a guide to build the trapezoids on top. If you have problems selecting it because it's below the other shapes, just hold Alt and click on the stroke till you select it. Holding Alt allows you to select objects occluded by others. We want to be able to see the square in the bottom through this square hole. You'll see why in a minute. Here comes the interesting part. Pick the top trapezoid and go to the Fill and Stroke dialog. Find the alpha slider, the last one, and start lowering the alpha of the white color. That is the transparency, till you kinda can see the bottom color. In this case you can see how it started showing the green color through. This is gonna be the highlight. We wanted a lighter green, but instead of giving it the color directly by assigning it a lighter green shade, we are using a transparent white shape on top to tint the color to a lighter green. Repeat the same step with the other white trapezoid, but this time lower even more the alpha slider, till you get a shade in between the highlight and the color of the base square. This side has a darker highlight to imply that the light hits less this plane. Now repeat the same steps with the black trapezoids. You'll want the darkest plane to be the opposite of the lightest, so lower the alpha accordingly. And this is how it should look. It should give the impression that each trapezoid is a different plane, with the light hitting the planes at different angles. But you may be wondering, why tinting? Why not just give the right color straight away? Well, here comes the really cool part. At any moment you can select the base square and change the color. And the cool thing is that, because we use neutral colors with transparency for the illumination, they will automatically adapt. So I'm super quickly creating different color variations of the entire square simply by changing the color of a single object. If you played around with the colors, you should realize that not all color hues react the same with the highlight and shadows. If you give the base square a naturally lighter color, like yellow, it may blend too much with the highlights. The same if you give it a naturally darker color, like blue. The shadows may not react as well. This is because different hues have different natural lightness levels. So what I recommend you to do is to pick the color you like, and if you see the highlight or shadows are blending in too much, make some quick adjustment with the alpha slider to maintain the relative distance between them and the hue. Now that we are working with slightly more complex pieces, this is where it starts to get interesting. You could change the proportions of the planes, the roundness, and especially the illumination. What planes are in highlights and what are in shadows. So here are some variations I made. Okay, now let's make the most complex piece style. This one that looks really shiny and detailed. The techniques you learn by making this piece will give you a ton of flexibility to create pretty much any type of piece you may ever want. So start with the square. Remove the stroke and give it a nice looking color. Just like in the previous piece, we'll be using transparency so we can super quickly and easily change colors after it's been created. Build the same shape as before, create the square in the middle and then the trapezoids. If you don't remember how to do it, rewatch the last lesson. Now it's time to give them color, but this time instead of using a single color, we'll be using gradients. This is what will give them this nice looking depthness and detail. Select the top trapezoid, go to the gradient tool, make sure this little button is selected. This button will create a linear gradient. The other one, the one that says radial gradient, we'll apply a gradient in circular form, which will be really nice to experiment later on. Also make sure that this other little button is selected as well, so you can apply the gradient to the fill rather than the stroke. Now drag a straight line vertically from one edge of the trapezoid to the other. I recommend you to hold Ctrl while you drag. This will apply a constraint so you can drag the line completely straight. And by default the tool will create a gradient between the two ends, called stops. That will be the selected color on one stop and the selected color but with the alpha slider completely turned down in the other stop. Let's change the colors. To do so, you need first to select a stop. To select a stop, you can either click on it with the gradient tool or select it with the node selection tool. Selecting a shape with the gradient with the node selection tool will show you the gradient line with the stop so you can edit its position by moving each stop. Give the two stops white and make sure they both have full alpha. Now the trapezoid is completely white, but what we are gonna do now is lower the opacity of both. So select the upper one and lower the alpha quite a lot, to about 1/4 of the alpha slider. As far as the other one, lower the alpha to about the 3/4 point, in such a way that the upper stop is way more transparent than the lower stop. Now you should adjust the opacity of each stop so the transition is nice and pleasant looking. You want a clearly defined transition between the strong highlight and the weak highlight. Now follow the same steps with the one on the right. But now, just like in the previous piece we made, make the overall highlight of the side plane less strong. So make both stops a bit more transparent, while still keeping the clear transition between strong highlight and weak highlight. For the bottom plane it's the same, only that you should use black instead of white. This plane is the overall darkest plane. Put the darkest shadow on top and transition it to the slightly less dark shadow on the bottom. Follow the same process with the other plane in shadow, but again make it overall less dark than the bottom plane. Now it's time to give a gradient to the square that makes up the top plane. What we'll be doing is making a gradient that contrasts with the upper and lower planes. So give the top stop full black and the lower stop full white. Now play with the alpha of both. What you want is to give the impression of a subtle depression in the plane, so make sure that the highlight is lighter than the top plane, and the shadow slightly darker than the bottom plane. It's almost done, but to give it a nice looking detail, pick the pen tool and create this line between this diagonal where the light should be coming from. Give it white color and lower the alpha a bit. This is supposed to be the sharp highlight that often gets captured in the corners. Make it a bit lighter than the other highlights. Highlights in corners tend to be really intense. Also make sure to give it the correct width. This is a highlight that is supposed to be captured by the edge, so if it's too big, it won't look right. Now create with the pen tool a line for the highlight for the other two corners. But instead of lowering the opacity, because the illumination on the right side should decay a bit, and the illumination on the top should stay strong, we're going to be using a gradient. Remember that you can apply gradients to both the fill and stroke. So click in the gradient tool and click on this little button here. This will set the gradient to be applied to the stroke color. The fill won't be affected at all. Now drag from the top corner to the bottom. Give both stops full white. The top stop should be almost full alpha, and the lower stop should have no alpha at all. effectively making it completely invisible. This way the highlight fades, giving the impression that the light is hitting the side more indirectly. Overall, all these transparency adjustments should be made by pulling the camera way up and seeing how it looks from there. Remember that these tiles are gonna be really tiny on the screen of the user's mobile phone, so set the color and size keeping that in mind. And it's done. The really amazing thing is that this type of piece, just like the one before, will adapt to the color that you set the bottom square. If you have trouble selecting the color due to being shapes on top, remember that you can just alt-click to select obstructed shapes. And just like the piece before, most of the selected colors will work just fine. But some will require you to go in and adjust the transparency of a few shapes. This style of piece is by far the most complex one you'll be doing, but it's also by far the most interesting one. You have a lot of room to improve and make a ton of variations. You could, for example, use radial gradients instead of the linear ones we used, or you could alter the design. Now it's up to you to apply these techniques to create your own nice looking pieces. And to end this lesson on pieces, I want to create a particular style of piece that you see all the time in some Tetris inspired block sliding games. I call it the textured piece. Most of these block sliding games have pieces built of a single shape, like the fake 3D piece we made before. So by using the square to better measure the proportions, duplicate it and build a common Tetris piece. And then perform a union by selecting them all and hitting Ctrl+. Now I want to create the outer planes that we've been using to imply different planes. But because the object is not a perfect square and the sides are not equal, I can't simply duplicate the shape and scale it like we did with the squares to create the inset. Lucky for us, there is a command that allows you to offset any type of shape. So duplicate the shape and go to Path, Dynamic Offset, or use the shortcut Ctrl+J. Then scale a bit with the little white circle. Depending on the shape, Dynamic Offset may smooth a bit the corners. We don't care about the inner shape. We need it as a guide to create the trapezoid. So a quick solution will be to just eyeball where the corners will be where it's rounded. And that's exactly what I'm gonna do. Now it's just a matter of giving them the whites and the blacks and setting the transparencies. So let's give this shape some kind of texture. I've seen a ton of games use this wood style for this type of puzzle games. So let's add a wood texture to make the piece look like it's made of wood. The first step should be getting the texture. Of course, you could easily Google wood texture to get a ton of images, but the problem is that if you want to use any of those textures in a commercial project, you may run into a few problems regarding copyright and that type of things. We'll be modifying those images and pretty much making them almost unrecognizable, but just to be sure and avoid any type of problems, I wouldn't use them in a commercial project. The alternative, if you don't want to pay for a commercial stock site like Graphic River or Shutterstock, is to find royalty-free images. There are a ton of royalty-free stock images and texture sites out there. In fact, I'll leave you in the resources a few links to some of the best sites I've found. However, I guess that for practice, there is no problem in getting images from Google. So I'm gonna import a nice wood texture I have here on my desktop, which by the way, I leave it in the resources of this lesson, by clicking and dragging from my desktop to the program. This is a nice little feature that the program has. You can just drag your images from the operative system and the program will recognize them and import them. But you could have gone to File, Import, and find your image there to import. As far as this little dialog that appears when you import an image, just click OK and don't pay attention to it. It just has a couple of image quality options. The default settings are perfect. We're going to overlap this texture on our piece. But for this we need to use a couple of new options that you can find in the Objects dialog. To open it, go to Object, Objects. This dialog is really important for handling objects. It displays a list of all objects currently in the document, including layers, groups, paths, and images. But what really is important here is that you can apply blend modes and other effects to individual objects. A blend mode is a special effect that alters how the color of an object interacts with other objects below. Don't worry, it will make sense soon. So select the image you imported and go to the blend mode dropdown. Here you have a list of all different blend modes that will be applied to the selected object. So pick the blend mode overlay. And you should see how the image kinda shows through. This is because overlay is designed so you can overlay textures on top of other shapes. Notice how the color of the image interacts with the color of the piece in a convincing manner, as if the texture in the image now belongs to the piece. Of course, you can still select the piece and change its color. The effect is applied to the image, not to the piece. Almost always you will want to play around with the opacity slider. This works similarly to the alpha slider, only that here you can apply the transparency to the entire image. I should also mention that I found that the overlay blend mode is enough for the simplest texture overlays. But you should definitely try each of the other blend modes and experiment and see if some other one gives you nicer results. The multiply blend mode is particularly good for mostly light or white images, and the screen blend mode is really good with mostly dark images. Getting a nice result is a matter of playing around with the right blend mode and juggling with the opacity slider and the color of the objects below. Now, this will be a good time to make some adjustments, scale and move the image, and make it fit with the piece below. Great, we're almost done. But now we have to deal with the leftovers of the texture. The texture is a rectangular form and is clearly not limited to the silhouette of the piece. There is a quick technique you can use to do just that. We are going to be using a clip. First, select the objects that makes up your piece and duplicate them. Now you should have a copy of all objects that makes up your piece on top of the texture. This is important. With all the objects still selected, perform a union by using the shortcut Ctrl+. If you remember, a union will join all objects into a single object. So now you have a single object instead of the piece plus the other trapezoid shapes on top. This is a requirement for the next step. Now select both the piece on top plus the image. Then left click and go to Set Clip. The clip is a way to limit the visibility of an object to the silhouette of an object above. That's the reason why we duplicated and merged the piece, so we can limit the visibility of the image. Now there is this texture with the exact shape of the piece. You can still use the object selection tool and move and scale it around. And what's more important, you can also keep refining and changing blend modes and playing with the opacity and all. And that was it for overlapping texture to shapes. Now you can get a lot of flexibility with this technique. You can apply pretty much any texture you find online. And if you are subtle with the blend mode and the opacity, it'll look great. So experiment with this technique. You could use it to apply a different type of texture or add in a nice looking noise effect, or maybe to give particular details like cracks or other features. And the great thing is that this technique works with all the other pieces as well. So play around and experiment with these features. That's the best way to learn. In a Tetris game, the background area where the pieces are and the gameplay happens. It's called the Playfield, and it needs to be indicated somehow. If you're feeling lazy, you could just make a rectangle with a single color or a gradient, and that's it. But it shouldn't be too hard to give it a bit more detail to make the game overall better looking. So that's what we'll be doing in this lesson. First of all, you should know that the standard Tetris playfield is made of 10 columns and 20 or so rows. We'll be using a 10 by 20 grid all throughout this course. If you're not making a standard Tetris, you can ignore this restriction and only apply the techniques you learn here to some other area. I want to start with a simple but nice looking playfield, something that will be good for a more flat looking Tetris game, but that it shows a couple of nice techniques. I'll start with an imported flat tile that we made in the last lesson. Now what I want to do is to get the exact smoothing quantity and size of the tile. So I'll just copy and paste the rectangle, making sure to exit the group after. I want it to be a light grey, without the outline. Now it's time to create the playfield using this rectangle. So make sure that snapping is enabled with all the important options, and then pile up the squares, 10 to build a row, and then duplicate it 20 times. Very important, don't forget to select them all and group them with Ctrl G. Using the rectangle tool, fill the entire area with a darker grey rectangle, taking advantage of the snapping, and send it to the back so it's behind the tiles. I don't think they look good all tied up, so what we're gonna do is create a dividing line between each of the rows and columns. So pick the pen tool, make sure snapping is enabled, and draw a straight line down that separates all tiles. And remember that you can snap to the edges of a built-in shape, for as long as it hasn't been transformed to an object. If you did transform it to an object, then just place them really carefully in the exact middle. Give this stroke the same color than the dark gray rectangle so it looks like there is a space in between each tile. And make it nice and thick, but not so thick that it starts erasing the rounded edges. I can't tell you the exact width you need, because I don't know what size you're working on, so you're gonna have to eyeball it. Now duplicate this line and move it to all the other intersections. It doesn't matter that they aren't in the exact place, we're gonna be using a little trick to put them in the right place really quickly. And now we're gonna be using the Align and Distribute dialog. This dialog contains a lot of options to control the placement of multiple objects. To open it, go to Object, Align and Distribute. The option that we care is this one. This button will distribute all selected objects equidistantly. In our case in particular, we want this button that will distribute them horizontally. Because we want all straight lines to be in the intersection between two squares, that is, in equal distance of each other, all that we need is to make sure the first and last objects are exactly where they should be. Now select everything and hit the button. And now I'm gonna repeat the same process as before with the horizontal separators. Okay, now let's give the tiles a bit more interesting coloring. You can apply a gradient to all objects in a group in such a way that the group will behave as if it were a single object. So select the squares group and create a diagonal linear fill gradient. I want the top stop to be this light gray and the lower stop to be a darker gray, but maybe with a lower opacity. And the result should be that you get this almost silver looking background. As always, take your time to adjust and fine tune to get the look you want. Okay, now for a couple of final touches. First, I want to round off a bit the corners. For this we'll be using a clip. So group everything, make sure snapping is turned on, and drag a rectangle that snaps with the background group. Now round off a bit the edges with the built-in modifier. Select them both, right click and set clip. And now for one last detail. Again, drag a rectangle that snaps through the background area. The border roundness should match with the rectangle that you previously created, but if it doesn't, try to match it with the roundness of the corners of the background area as best you can. You should disable the fill so you can see better. Now give the stroke the same color as the back rectangle. Give it a nice thick stroke. And very important, send it to the background so it won't start to eat away from the background area as you make the stroke thicker. Play with the thickness. What you want is this nice looking rectangle that frames the playfield. And that's it for this playfield. Now it's up to you to make your own variations. This is a nice and quick idea for making attractive backgrounds. First, import one of the tiles with multiple planes that we made in the previous lesson, or redraw one in case you didn't save anything. What we're gonna do is to tile them up just like before, but we are gonna give it some nice effect. In order to make this effect, I'm giving it a light gray color, as if it were made of stone. Select all shapes that makes the square tile and hit H, then B. This will flip the square first horizontally and then vertically. And you will see that this will invert the colors. But if you look at it twice, you'll see that also kinda looks like the tile planes are going in instead of going out. As if the illumination still comes from above, but now the planes recede, so the opposite side gets the highlight. This happens because the shape is ambiguous regarding the form, so your brain can see it either way. Now it's just a matter of duplicating it and creating the playfield. If you want, you can do something similar to what we did in the previous case and create a line in between the tiles. This time make it pure black and lower the opacity a bit. You want to imply a small gap between tiles. And here is it, a playfield made of tiles. Of course, you could have created a completely new tile style, but the technique is the same. Inverting the highlights and shadows of the ones in the pieces will give you the feel that the shape is carved in. But if you're doing one of those block sliding puzzles, maybe you need a wood theme background to go with it. So here I created a rectangle to make the background area. And what we want is to give it some wood texture. So here I have imported a nice wood texture. We're gonna follow a similar process to the one we followed in the previous lesson with the wood piece. But we are making one tiny change. We want a different overall color. And to facilitate that, we are gonna make some pre-processing to the image. So it's easier to tint the texture to the color we want. We'll make it black and white. In the previous case, the color of the texture and the color we wanted kinda matched. We wanted a yellowish color and the image texture already had a yellowish tone. But now we want full control over the tint of the texture, and for that we need it to be black and white. Here's a nice and fast way to turn a color image to black and white inside Inkscape itself. Select the texture and go to Extensions, Raster, and here you go to HSB Adjust. Set the saturation to -100. Other values will not set it to black and white, so always use -100. Now follow the same technique that you used in the previous lesson. Open the Objects dialog. Set the texture to overlay, lower the opacity, clip it if needed, and fine-tune it by adjusting the opacity and the color of the objects below. Now let's give the playfield a nice looking dark orange-brown to simulate a darker type of wood, and also to contrast with the color of the pieces. Always remember to select overall colors that contrast nicely with the overall color of your pieces. This is where you can use the HSL mode to move the lightness and saturation sliders up and down to see what color contrasts and looks better with your pieces. If you have problems selecting the background area because the texture is on top, remember that you can select an object obscured by another by holding Alt and clicking till you select it. Okay, now it's done. But you can give it some small details to make it look nicer. We can give it a gradient. Since the texture is set to both overlay and with lower transparency, the gradient will show through and look really neat. So select the rectangle below first, and then click on the gradient tool. This time we'll be applying a radial gradient, so switch to the gradient mode in the tool controls. And draw a big and round gradient. Adjust the shape with the stops if you need. The trick is first giving the two stops the same color, and then in the inner stop, slightly move the lightness and saturation sliders using the HSL color selection mode. The effect is really subtle, but it does make a difference. And that's it. The texture background area is complete. Now you can do a lot of things using this technique, not just wood textures. It's just as easily creating a wood background as it is creating a brick background or a space background. All you have to do is find the right texture and play around with the right settings. Remember to check the lesson with the resources with the royalty-free images. And as always, make sure to play around and experiment with everything you learn. Next lesson we are gonna apply everything you've learned so far and create a simple but complete Tetris mockup. Now it's time to apply everything you've learned so far. In this lesson we'll be making a full Tetris clone mockup. The first step, before wasting a single minute doing something that may not work, is to block in the composition. That is, to make the layout of the different components using simple shapes. In traditional illustration, this will be called the thumbnail. Making thumbnails speeds up the overall process of the illustration, because you make all big picture decisions really quick and effectively, without wasting time actually illustrating. With a thumbnail, you can often tell immediately if the disposition of the UI elements will work or not. Plus, it's really fast to create a ton of variations to choose from, really quick. So let's take a minute to enumerate all different parts that we need in our Tetris game. First, of course, you have the Playfield. Then there are the windows that displays the different information like the score, current level, or erased lines. And one more important that shows the next piece. Because this is meant to be a mobile game, we need buttons to control the game. Mobile Tetris often use 4 buttons to control the pieces, and one more to open up the main menu. And again, because this is a mobile game, we are gonna need to display a couple of other user details in a bar somewhere. As far as the design itself, you may want to check the Google Play Store to check screenshots of real life games like the ones you are doing, to see what are the common elements and how they are organized. You can learn a lot by just checking out what is the standard for the way an interface looks. You don't need to be super original, but I wouldn't plain straight steal the layout of another game. I will at least try to make some minor changes so it won't feel like a knockoff. So first let's start with the main windows. This rectangle should be of the length and width of the average screen that is gonna be played. Because most of these games are meant to be played in a mobile phone, we are gonna be using the resolution of the average screen, 1080 by 1920. And to make sure this is the actual size of the rectangle, we're gonna set the resolution in the options in the tool controls of the rectangle tool. First, change to the px unit, and then set the width and height in the boxes, 1080 by 1920. Now it's just a matter of creating darker rectangles and position them in a nice and pleasant way. There are no rules here. The only thing I can do is to give you a couple of rules of thumb you can follow. First, try to align and center the different components. It doesn't matter if the element has a rectangular form or not. Always think of it as if it were a rectangle. It's faster to draw and easier. Also try not to leave too much empty spaces, but don't clutter. Every element should be immediately identifiable. Also, more important elements should be bigger and with higher contrast. This way, the user knows what to look and what to do in a second. And it's done. In this case, I made a single version because I knew what I wanted. But it's very common that you make multiple variations so you can pick the best one from the bunch. Obviously, in a game like Tetris, there is no need for a complex layout. The game is very well known and the layout is very generic. But in the case you want to make a more unique Tetris-inspired block puzzle game that has nothing to do with the way a Tetris game plays, then you need to be a bit more careful with the layout and with what it communicates with the user. Now let's start making the final artwork. So what I'm gonna do is to give the block shapes a rough color, just to pre-visualize a bit better how the game is gonna look. The best tip I can give you is to forget about color theory and find a game you like and steal its colors. The problem with color theory is that it's way too general and loose for a beginner, and it really won't help you pick the actual colors. So if you instead pick colors from a screenshot of a game that you like, it doesn't have to be a Tetris game or even a game, it could be an illustration, then you already know what the colors will look. Also, color stealing is pretty much the only type of plain straight stealing that is allowed and well seen in illustration. Now for the playfield. I could have gone and imported any playfield that I made in the previous lesson, but I thought it would be nice to show you an extra example. What I'm gonna do now is gonna be similar to the first one, the metal one with the rounded edges. So create the 10 by 20 playfield using squares with a nice thick stroke and no fill. Now place it inside of the playfield rectangle. Remember that if you hold Ctrl when you scale, you can maintain the proportions so the playfield won't get distorted. Don't worry if the previous gray square you made doesn't fit with the real proportions of the playfield. You're gonna be adjusting over and over again all these elements. Use the rectangle that you used as the previous playfield to darken the area. Just give it a really dark blue. This is important so the pieces are clearly visible. Fit this rectangle to the real area of the playfield. Now let's give the grid a color. First make them white and apply a linear gradient but to the stroke instead of the fill. To give it a more 3D look, add a stop in the middle by double clicking with the gradient tool and make the stop full white. Then make the other two white but lower the alpha a bit. You should see this wavy effect. Also, if the overall white is too strong, remember that you can lower the opacity of the entire grid group with the opacity slider. To make the playfield pop a bit more, add this dark blue outline on top and give it a nice thickness and of course no fill. The whole theme of this mockup is gonna be this truncated pyramid that you saw in a previous lesson. We're gonna be using this shape over and over again. Reusing a visual motif is a very common thing you'll see in most games. So here at the top is gonna be the first one. All of these are gonna be drawn exactly the same as we did with the other tiles. Make 4 trapezoid shapes with transparent black and white colors, and then delete the rectangle in the middle, so you can adjust the hue whenever you want. Now I'm playing with the right position for each element. This is a common occurrence when working like this. The thumbnail layout is there as a design guide, but you're still gonna have to make some minor adjustments with the different elements and where they fit. At the top of each element that's gonna display information, these 4 on the side, they all gonna have this truncated pyramid design on top to display a text with the title. So repeat the same steps as before. To create the highlights and shadows, I'm using a nice feature of the program. You can copy the fill and stroke properties. This includes the color and alpha of the fill and stroke and whether they are enabled or not, of one object and then paste them into another one. So what I'm doing now is simply copying the plane object whose properties I want to copy using Ctrl C, and then selecting the plane object whose properties I want to paste and hitting Ctrl Shift B. This way is not only faster, but I get the exact color and alpha value replicated in the plane. Something that you'll see me do all the time to adjust the position of the different elements is using the dialog we saw in the previous lesson, the align and distribute. But this time I'm using the align set of options. I'm using mostly to align the information display elements on the right with the top or bottom of the playfield, so it looks nice and organized. By the way, I often use shortcuts to open dialogs. The shortcut to open the align and distribute dialog is Ctrl-Shift-A. There's no need to go through all of that again, so duplicate the pyramid and paste it into the other elements. Because I want this element to contain information like the current level or the score or the next piece, I'm gonna create an area inside to make the display text a bit more interesting. What I want to do is to make the text displaying area a bit transparent. Pay attention cause this may not be obvious in the video. First I create an inset with a duplicate of the element rectangle where the text is gonna be. Then I duplicate the insert rectangle. And with that I perform a difference with the element rectangle. The shortcut is Ctrl and minus. This should leave a hole in the middle. But now, because I duplicated the insert rectangle, a copy is still there. So I'll give it a full black and lower the alpha to make it transparent. This is another great thing of working digitally. You can make a thing once and duplicate it, and that's what I'm doing now with the smaller info boxes. Now for the buttons. These are gonna be truncated pyramids as well, but with a couple more details on top. To imply an indentation plane, just make the plane black and lower the opacity. Planes that are indented are always darker, so remember that if you want to imply an indentation. I could have created a complex symbol here to indicate going left, but I didn't want to waste time, so I just used the lower than text symbol that I created with the text tool. And then I made it really big and then used the align and distribute options to center it. Of course, this is gonna be the button to move a piece to the left. Because this symbol is supposed to be indented as well, make it black and lower the alpha, so it's slightly darker than the indented plane that is in. Duplicate this object and move it. And for going right, just invert horizontally the lower than symbol. You can use the shortcut H. For the drop button, I'm just rotating the symbol using the rotate command in the tool controls of the object selection tool. For the rotate, I decided to create a simple symbol. Here I just used the spiral tool to create this half open circle and give it a really thick stroke. Then I used the pen tool to create the point of the arrow. I transformed the open circle to an object, cause it still was a built-in object, and joined everything using Ctrl+. To give it the right color, I just copy and paste the style of one of the arrows. If you don't want to complicate yourself with icons, you can always use one of those free vector symbol sites. There are a ton of sites with generic vector icons, and a lot of them are free to use and royalty free. In fact, I'll leave you in the resources a link with a couple of them. These sites are nice because mobile games usually have a lot of standard symbols like arrows and user icons and that kind of stuff. The final symbol is the standard 3 dashes that's often used to open menus. These are just 3 straight lines made with the pen tool with a really thick stroke. Okay, now for the details and the finishing touches. I want to start by adding a few highlights and shadows to make the buttons pop up a bit more. A technique used to create a very convincing illusion of an indentation is to create a shadow dropping from the side the light is coming from, and then a very intense rim highlight on the opposite side to the light. Of course, this works because it's exactly what happens in real life. This works great with buttons if you want to simulate some sort of carving, maybe with text or a symbol, like in our case. Now, if you want to follow this technique with simple objects like square or dashes, it's super easy. You just create the shadow shape and then you create the highlight shape. But if you want to create the shadow and highlight shape of a more complex symbol, then you can't just create those shapes manually. You'll most likely want to generate the shadow and highlight using Boolean operations. So let me show you the whole process to do that in a clearer example. Because this is a technique extremely common in any form of illustration, so you'll be using it a lot. So here I have this fairly complex shape. Making the highlights and shadows by hand will be really tedious. So let's suppose that the lighting comes from above, like in most cases. The first step is creating the shadow. For this we are going to be using a difference Boolean operation. Duplicate the symbol. Now duplicate it again. You'll see why in a minute. Now you have 3 piled objects that are exactly the same. Select the first one, the one on top, and give it a color. Any color that allows you to differentiate this symbol from the copy below. Now move it down as much as you want the shadow to extend. You can use the arrow keys to move it just a bit. Now select both, the symbol on top and the symbol below, and perform a difference operation. The difference operation will delete any part of the object below that's in contact with the object above. So the only thing left from the object below is the area that was visible. Now it may seem that nothing happened, but in reality the object is there and selected. You should pick a darker color, or better yet, make it black and then lower the alpha to get that nice shadow effect. Now for the rim highlight. For the rim highlight is the same. Duplicate the original symbol twice, change color so you can see the object above better, but this time move the object up instead of down. And remember that we are making a rim highlight, which is very thin, so don't move it up too much. Perform the difference and give it a full white, and lower the opacity. Now you have 3 objects, the base symbol, a shadow dropping, and an intense rim highlight. Like I said before, this technique is extremely common to any type of illustration, and once you know how to do it, you're gonna be seeing it in illustrations all the time. Also, you could revert the shadow and highlight to imply that the object is going out instead of going in. As always, you should experiment by yourself and practice doing this with all types of shapes. Besides, it's really fun to make things appear to go in or out just using 2D shapes. Okay, I'm gonna make the symbols in the buttons appear like indentations. But here is a little warning. In this video I messed up with the shadows and the highlight color. I got mixed up and I ended up improvising to fix it. In the end I managed to make it work, but be warned that I overcomplicated the things accidentally. That's the reason why I wanted to show you how to do it properly. So what I'm saying is that you should keep that in mind if you are following what I'm doing. Do the indentations properly like I just showed you. Don't follow exactly what I'll be doing now. So you already know what to do and what not to do to make the detailed indentations, so I'll fast forward this section. The only thing that differs from the example that I showed you a moment ago is that I decided to use the pen tool to make the highlights. I thought that the shapes were super easy and they didn't warrant to create an extra Boolean operation, so I just made a white line and lowered a bit the opacity. The only part that I could be slightly tricky is this part. Here I'm still doing the highlights using the pen tool, but because this is a curved section, I'm thinking only in the parts of the rounded edge that are pointing up. You don't need to be super accurate. Eyeball it and don't forget any section. As far as the intensity, don't forget the distance from where it's gonna be seen. As I said before, this is meant to be a mobile game, so it's meant to be displayed in a relatively small screen. If you're too subtle with the color, with such a thin line, it's not gonna be visible. That's why I'm giving it a fairly intense white, to make up for the small shape. Here I thought that the playfield contrasted too much with the background, so I lowered the opacity. That's another reason for the playfield to be in a group. You can just lower the opacity of all objects of that group at the same time with the opacity slider. I wanted a nice big font size to fit the title. Luckily in my case the font and size was exactly what I needed, but depending on the style you're going for, you may need to find and install new fonts. For a more neutral style like the style of this project, the font Helvetica is just perfect. It comes with the program and it looks nice. Also remember that you can just scale the font to make the font bigger or smaller. But remember that this is gonna change the font size property in the tool controls of the text tool. Centering the symbol with the align and distribute. Adjusting the size. Scaling it to change the font size. Here, because I scaled the text in and I want the exact font size for all text, I had to go in and change the size property in the tool controls of each object. And that's what I'm doing now, making all text the same size. And now I wanted to make some icon to simulate some sort of account, where the user will log in with a username and an optional small avatar. You don't have to do this. In fact, I believe that most Tetris games don't have this type of account-based gameplay, but I thought that it would be cool to add a couple of small details like this. These ellipses are meant to be a stand-in for the user who did not pick a avatar. I want you to notice that I try to use the same colors for all outlines, and the same colors for all fonts. This is so the design is consistent. Awesome User 87 is meant to be a username that the user picked for the account. Another thing I want to do is to make some bar to indicate some sort of progression. Just like with the accounts, many mobile games have some sort of level progression in the account. So that's what I'm doing now. As far as the bar, the colors are just a variation of the other colors. Again, I'm making the classic drop shadow and rim highlight that we've been using all throughout this course. But here, to make the highlight, because the object is symmetrical, I just duplicated the shadow, inverted it vertically, move it down, and change the color to white. It's just a little time save. You can go and do it with a difference if you want. And now I'm making a small fun little detail. I'm making really quickly a couple of coins to put right next to the bar to imply that the level is somehow related to the in-game currency. Since these coins are meant to be really small, I'm not worrying about adding too much detail, so they are basically made of two ellipses and a dollar sign. To add a bit more contrast, I duplicated all the coins and made them black, and then I increased a bit the blur to imply a shadow. I grouped and aligned everything so everything is nice and centered. Now for the last finishing touches. I brought a couple of pieces. They are made with the same tile that I created in a previous lesson. I only recolored the tile and made the different pieces with it. I've also brought this picture that I'm gonna use as a texture to put in the background, so it's a bit more interesting. I'll leave it in the resources, but you can put any image you want in the background, but I would recommend any picture that at least kinda looks abstract, but it's up to you. You could put a picture of a beach or mountains, or even a texture like wood or metal would look nice. So the very first thing you should do is to make your image black and white. If you remember, just go to Extensions, Raster, HSP Adjust, and then set the saturation to -100. You probably know the drill by now. Open the Objects dialog and set the texture to Overlay, or whatever blend mode works for your texture, and lower the opacity. Don't forget this texture goes on top of the main blue rectangle, but below everything else. Otherwise, it'll colorize the other UI elements as well. So this texture does not fit the main window's ratio. So instead of enlarging it and heavily distorting it to fit the main rectangle shape, I'll just place a copy on top of each other, since it'll be hidden behind the playfield and the other elements. There is nothing wrong with making your own custom texture by grouping multiple images. So here I want to cut out the excess on top without scaling the image or distorting it. So to simplify everything, I'm gonna select all 3 copies of the texture and group them with Ctrl G. And now I can apply a clip. Again, I'm sure you know the drill by now. Make a copy of the main window's rectangle, select the copy and the group texture, right click and set clip. And now to place the pieces. Here I'm taking a minute to carefully scale down each piece to the size of the grid. A nice tip is that the more you zoom in, the easier it becomes making really small adjustments. Also, don't forget to hold Ctrl to scale maintaining the proportions. But don't forget that this is a mockup, and we only need it to look nice from a big distance. There's no need to worry too much. Making the pieces fit in a real Tetris game would be the work of the programmer. And here I wanted to create one of those preview guides that many modern Tetris games comes with. This is really simple to make. I trace over a piece with a pen tool and snapping enabled. I played with a few color settings, but I ended up giving it a white transparent feel. and a full white thick stroke. And to give it a nice final touch, I went to the Stroke Style tab in the Fill and Stroke dialog, and I set the dashes drop down to some dashes that I thought look cool. The dashes drop down allows you to transform a simple stroke to a stroke made of different types of dashes. You can still modify the stroke after this effect has been applied. It's pretty much useless for most illustrations, but every once in a while you can find it some use. And here's an occasion. Now that the pieces are set, I can see that the playfield area rectangle is way too distracting. So I selected the group and lowered the opacity even more. Lowering the opacity does diminish the impact of the gradient, but in a game, clarity is way more important than impact. And it's done. Your own Tetris game mockup. Well, you're done with the course. Congratulations. I really hope you had fun with it and that you've learned a lot of new things. Now it's time for you to take the next step. I always recommend to practice copying other art, seeing what you can replicate using the program. This will not only help you practice what you've learned here, but also improve your visual library, so you can later on design a much better looking puzzle game. If you're interested in continue learning with me, I have a couple of other courses on character and background design. They are also for beginners and also made entirely using Inkscape, so you should definitely check them out if you're interested. I also plan to keep making game art courses in the near future, so you should keep an eye open if you're planning to learn more about game art. Don't forget that you can contact me by email or by Facebook. I'll try to answer any questions as fast as I can. Well, have fun drawing and I see you next course.